My name is Aidan Mercer. I'm 23 years old, and I built a financial software company from the ground up in Savannah, Georgia, a place where success still wears mud on its boots and smells like gasoline and sweat. If you're hearing my voice right now, don't scroll past. This story isn't just about proving someone wrong. It's about finding your voice when the world says you don't belong. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, because stories like this might just be what someone out there needs to hear. My father, Ray Mercer, ran a construction business for 3 decades and believed that real men built things with their hands. He wore that belief like a badge. When I chose finance and code over bricks and beams, I didn't just break tradition, I broke something sacred to him. He didn't yell. That would have been easier. He just looked at me the way you look at a cracked foundation, disappointed, but not surprised. "You never had the grit for real work," he muttered once, walking past my room where I sat hunched over lines of Python code, fingers cramping, eyes bloodshot. He didn't know I was working on a predictive market model that might someday rival what the big banks use. All he saw was a boy hiding behind a screen. For 3 years, I gave up weekends, birthdays, holidays. While my friends posted brunch selfies, I debugged algorithms at 2 a.m. in a shoebox apartment with rent I could barely afford. He never asked what I was building, just shrugged and said I'd be back mixing cement by summer. And honestly, maybe that's what fueled me most, not the ambition, but the disbelief. Every time he told an uncle or neighbor that I was still figuring things out, I added one more feature to my software. Every Thanksgiving joke, every Christmas eye roll, it all became data, input, firewood. You know, when someone calls you useless enough times, you start to catalog it like code errors, repeat statement, low-value output, unoptimized view. But I wasn't broken. I was still compiling. And someday, I swore to myself, I'd push the final build. Back in college, I was the quiet one in the back row, always sketching diagrams instead of taking notes. I wasn't chasing grades. I was chasing something else entirely. Patterns, trends, possibilities that most people couldn't see. I'd gotten into the University of Georgia's business program on partial scholarship. My mom, Evelyn, cried when the acceptance letter came. My dad didn't even read it. He just slapped a 20 on the counter and said, "Don't come home soft." That was his version of encouragement. But Mom, she slipped me $500 she'd been saving from tutoring sessions and whispered, "Go build something that makes you proud to wake up." I think about that a lot. It was during my sophomore year that the spark turned into fire. I was in an econometrics class when I realized all these formulas, they could be more than theory. They could be tools. I stayed up 3 nights straight, building a prototype, a basic algorithm that could scan market sentiment from news patterns and social media noise. I showed it to my professor, a guy who barely remembered my name. He read the results, sat back in his chair, and said, "This could change how everyday people invest." And just like that, everything tilted. I dropped out the following semester. I didn't tell my dad until the paperwork was filed. When I called home, Mom cried again. But not from pride this time, from fear. And Dad? He didn't even say goodbye, just hung up. I moved into a shared apartment in downtown Savannah with 2 roommates and 1 leaky ceiling. We split rent 3 ways and kept ramen noodles in bulk. I traded lecture halls for libraries, textbooks for trial code, and I poured myself into my work like a man possessed. I applied to every early-stage accelerator and VC program I could find. Most laughed me off. Too young, no business pedigree, not enough traction. Every rejection I printed out and taped to my bedroom wall, not as motivation, but as receipts. Proof of all the doors I wasn't allowed to walk through. And still, I kept knocking. Liam, one of my freshman year roommates, stuck with me. He'd drop off sandwiches when I forgot to eat. He sat through practice pitches that made 0 sense and always ended with, "You've got something, Aiden. Don't let this world talk you out of it." He believed in me when I didn't. And back home, my father still told everyone I was doing some app thing that would blow over. He even offered me a foreman job at his site one Christmas, like I hadn't built anything at all. But I wasn't coming back to pour concrete. I was building something else, just invisible, for now. Last Thanksgiving, I drove back to Savannah Heights for the family dinner, even though every part of me wanted to skip it. There's a kind of silence that builds when people don't believe in you. It doesn't shout, it simmers. Dinner was loud, laughs, clinks of forks, football on the TV. But every time I tried to talk about my work, about where things were heading, the room shifted. Someone changed the subject. My uncle cracked a joke. My father refilled drinks. And then I heard it. He was standing in the kitchen with Uncle Donnie, the guy he always tried to impress. I was walking by when I caught the words, "Aiden'll be back pouring concrete by summer. That kid couldn't sell lemonade in July." They both laughed, loud enough that they knew I could hear. I didn't flinch, didn't speak. I just grabbed my coat, helped Mom pack leftovers into Tupperware, and drove back to my apartment in silence. That night, I finalized the biggest licensing proposal of my life. I'd spent 3 months in back-and-forth meetings with a hedge fund in New York, fine-tuning legal terms and exclusivity rights. The deal would give them full access to my predictive tech, for 8 figures. I didn't tell anyone, because I'd learned by now. When people see you one way for long enough, they don't want to see anything else. My mind drifted back to the summers I'd spent working for Dad. I was 12 the first time he tossed me gloves and pointed to a pile of gravel. Every year, I'd sweat through Georgia's July heat, hauling pavers and mixing mortar under the sun. That was his gospel. Sweat proves worth. And he did build something. From a single flatbed truck, he created a business with 20 employees and his name on the side of every van. He taught me discipline, drive, how to grind through a hard day. But somewhere along the way, he confused working hard with hurting. The day I got accepted into college, he barely reacted. "You college kids think you're better than the rest of us," he muttered, handing me $20 like I was taking a bus ride, not starting a new chapter. He never asked what classes I liked, never visited the campus, never saw the projects I stayed up all night to finish. And yet, every time I succeeded, a piece of me still wanted him to see. Understand that my work, while not done with my hands, came from the same place: grit, precision, commitment. But he couldn't or wouldn't see that. So instead of forcing him to believe, I made a promise to myself. I'd build something so undeniable, so big, so loud, it would speak for me. And when it did, he'd hear it. Fan Can Bon, I bought it because it couldn't be ignored. The deal with Redwood Capital had closed just 3 days earlier. $14 million wired to my newly formed LLC, locking in exclusive rights to my algorithm for 5 years. When the wire cleared, I didn't celebrate. I just stared at the screen. Then I called Liam, and he screamed loud enough to set off my neighbor's dog. My mom cried again, this time from something closer to pride. I didn't call my dad. He hadn't asked how things were going in over a year. Instead, I found myself in a glass showroom off Bay Street, surrounded by chrome and leather and disinterest. Salesman barely looked at me until I mentioned my price range. Then they offered me coffee. 2 hours later, I drove off the lot in a red Ferrari Roma. Not because I wanted flash, but because it was the loudest quiet I could buy. I timed my return to Savannah Heights for exactly 2 p.m. on Memorial Day. The one day a year when my father opened his backyard to every client, employee, and distant relative within driving distance. He called it a tradition. I called it theater. As I turned the corner onto our old street, the engine's low rumble echoed off mailboxes and carports. Heads turned before they even saw the car. I parked right next to Dad's work truck, his pride still spotless after all these years. I stepped out wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt. No speech, no announcement, just the sound of gravel crunching under my shoes as I walked toward the house. The conversation stopped mid-sentence, like someone had hit mute. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. My cousin blinked like I was a glitch in the simulation. Dad stood at the grill, spatula in midair, frozen. "Sorry I'm late," I said. Traffic from Atlanta was brutal. He recovered quickly, smile wide but empty, the one he used for clients who hadn't paid. "Well, look who's back. Whose car did you borrow to make that entrance, son?" Laughter, nervous, thin. "I didn't borrow it," I said. "It's mine. Bought it yesterday." He chuckled and nodded at Uncle Donnie like it was all a joke. "Sure, and I'm flying a helicopter to work next week." I pulled the title from my back pocket and handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly. His face didn't change, but his hands did. Tightened slightly around the paper before he folded it again and handed it back. "Must be nice to have friends who trust you with their toys," he muttered, turning back to the grill. "Grab a plate. Your mom made that potato salad you like." I wanted to say more, to shout, to explain, to demand some kind of acknowledgement. But I didn't. Because I realized something, standing there surrounded by burgers and folding chairs and forced smiles. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finally being seen. All afternoon, I tried to find a quiet moment to talk to him. Just a minute, just a real moment. But every time I opened my mouth, he found something to refill. Drinks, the cooler, his own ego. When I brought up the licensing deal, he pivoted to mulch prices. When I mentioned the tech behind the algorithm, he pointed out someone's flower bed across the street. It was like I was speaking a language he'd forgotten how to hear. And when Mr. Parsons, his longtime business partner, brought up the article in Bloomberg South, the one with my face on the cover, Dad didn't miss a beat. "You know how those reporters are," he said. "Always blowing smoke. Don't believe everything you read." It stung. Not because I needed him to brag, but because he couldn't even admit it was real. By evening, the yard had thinned out. Plastic cups littered the grass, the music had faded, and people were starting to say their goodbyes. I found him alone in his office, sorting through paperwork like he always did after events. It was his ritual, his reset. "Dad," I said, standing in the doorway, "can we talk? Really talk?" He didn't look up. "If this is about that car again." "It's not. It's about what I've built, the company, the deal. What's coming next?" He set his pen down, slowly. "There's nothing to talk about. You got lucky with some computer thing. Doesn't make you a man." "It wasn't luck," I said carefully. "It was 3 years of 100-hour weeks, 400 versions of the algorithm, 1,000 rejections." His eyes narrowed. "You know what built this family, Aiden? Not pressing buttons, not pushing paper. It was this." He pointed to an old photo on the wall, him at 20 standing next to his first truck, sunburned, smiling. "That's real work. That's real success. And what I built isn't? He leaned forward in his chair. I've seen your kind. Flash in the pan. All money, no roots. You'll blow through that cash in a year, and those big city types will toss you out when you stop being shiny. I didn't interrupt. I just watched him spiral, not out of anger, fear. You'll come crawling back, he said, voice rising. And I'll have to explain to everyone why my son couldn't hack it in the real world. I took a breath. Long, even. I'm not coming back, Dad. He didn't answer, just picked up his pen again. I left without another word. In the kitchen, Mom was rinsing dishes under the soft hum of the overhead light. She turned, drying her hands on a towel. He's proud of you, she said gently. He just doesn't know how to show it. I shook my head. No, Mom. He's not proud. He's threatened. And for the first time, I said it out loud. The next morning, I was still replaying his words. Not the anger, but the certainty behind them. Like no matter what I built, I'd always be less than the boy who lifted bricks in the sun. My phone buzzed. It was Eli, my cousin, the only person in the family who ever asked about what I actually did. You might want to know, he texted. Uncle Ray's telling folks at church your deal fell through, said you rented that car for attention. I stared at the screen, waiting to feel something. Anger, shame, sadness. But what settled wasn't heat. It was clarity. Over the next week, I stayed in a hotel downtown. Just a few blocks from the office I was setting up. I didn't go home. I couldn't. I was getting messages from friends of the family, from old neighbors, from Mom's co-workers, asking if I was in legal trouble, if I'd lied, if the Ferrari was just a prop. Even Patricia from Redwood Capital called. Someone claiming to be your father rang our office, she said, asking for details about the licensing terms. We, of course, declined. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the undertone. What's going on? That night, I drove out to the house. I timed it so Dad wouldn't be home. Mom opened the door, still in her gardening gloves, visibly flustered but trying not to show it. She made coffee while I stood in the kitchen, watching the light flicker over old countertops. Mom, I said softly, going on with him. She didn't answer right away, just stirred her cup slowly. He's scared, she finally said. Scared of what? Me succeeding? No, she whispered. Scared of what your success means. I frowned. Meaning? She sat down, cupping her mug like a shield. The business is struggling, has been for years. The new chains, the landscaping franchises, they undercut his bids. Offer apps, same-day scheduling. He can't compete. I blinked. Why didn't he tell me? She didn't hesitate. Pride. That one word hit harder than anything my father had ever thrown at me. He remortgaged the house, she added, to buy new trucks, new software. He didn't want you to know. If he admits your way works, it means his way. Didn't. I sat back, stunned. This wasn't just a generational clash. It was grief. He was mourning a world that no longer existed. And somewhere in the rubble, I had become the symbol of everything he feared. Modern, digital, invisible. Not better, just different. But in his eyes, different had always meant betrayal. As I left the house, Mom stopped me at the door. Be gentle with him, she said, even when he's not. I didn't know how to explain that sometimes gentleness looks like boundaries, and sometimes it looks like walking away until they're ready to look you in the eye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the hotel room staring out at the Savannah River, the lights of cargo ships flickering like they were passing through time, some heading toward the future, others clinging to the past. And I knew something had to shift. I wasn't going to argue with my father anymore. I wasn't going to plead for his approval. I was going to take what I knew, what I'd built, and quietly reshape the world around him. I picked up the phone and called Patricia Donovan at Redwood. "I need research," I said. "Landscaping companies in Georgia, especially the coastal region. I want to know who's growing, who's selling, who's hurting." She didn't ask why. She just said, "Give me till noon." By midday, I had a spreadsheet with 3 top regional players. One name stood out: Evergrove Services, expanding fast, high-tech systems, looking to acquire older operations. I reached out to Henry Roth, their CEO. We set up a meeting for the next morning at their Jacksonville office. That afternoon, I called a commercial real estate agent. I needed space, something industrial, near downtown Savannah, a place I could transform into something bold. I told him I wanted 15,000 square feet minimum. Modern infrastructure, old bones. By 6 p.m., I had 3 listings in my inbox. And by 9 a.m. the next day, I was sitting across from Henry in a glass-walled conference room. "We've had our eye on Mercer Landscaping for a while," he admitted after I walked him through the potential. "Great client base, strong regional reputation, but your dad doesn't even return our calls. What if I could change that?" He raised an eyebrow. "Then we're listening." By that evening, I had a formal offer in hand. $1.3 million, nearly double what the business was currently worth. 5-year employment contract for my father. Full job retention for his crew, health benefits included. It wasn't a buyout, it was a lifeline. I also signed the lease for the warehouse. It needed work, cracked concrete, exposed beams. But I could see it, a tech hub, a headquarters. Not just for me, but for what comes next. The final move came with one phone call. "Eli," I said, "how would you feel about coming on as COO?" He was stunned. "Me? Aiden, I've never even managed a team." "Neither had I when I started," I said. "But you believe in this, and I need someone I can trust." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, "Yeah, I'm in." As I hung up, I looked at the folder in my hand. The offer, the lease, the new beginning. This wasn't revenge. It was rescue. Not of my father's pride, but of everything he spent his life trying to build. 3 days passed. I hadn't answered a single one of his texts. They started polite. "Let's talk business." Then firm. "Dinner. Tomorrow." Yeti. Then angry. "Don't ignore me, Aiden." I ignored them all, because this time I wasn't coming with explanations. I was coming with solutions. I drove to the house on a Thursday afternoon just before dusk. I knew he'd be in his office, finishing payroll or rechecking invoices for the 3rd time like he always did. The lights were on. His truck was out front. The same toolbox sat in the same place on the porch, untouched for decades. I walked in without knocking. He didn't look up. "Decided to show up after all," he said, still writing something. "Was beginning to think that car was more important than family." I didn't come to talk about the car. I sat across from him and placed a folder on his desk. His name was on the tab. He opened it halfway. "What is this? Another pitch?" "No," I said. "It's an acquisition offer from Evergrove Services. They want to buy Mercer Landscaping." The change in his face was immediate. Not shock, defense. "You went behind my back," he said quietly. "You went to my competitors?" "I went ahead of you," I corrected. "Dad, the business is bleeding. This is a way out. You keep your crew. You keep your title. They're offering you a 5-year regional leadership contract with benefits, profit sharing." His voice rose. "You think I built this company just to sell it to the first guy waving a check?" I think you built something incredible, but you're exhausted and you're losing ground. This offer doesn't erase your legacy. It preserves it." He stood up, his hands trembling, not with fear, but pride colliding with panic. "So that's your plan? Buy your way into respect? Flash your Wall Street toys and expect me to roll over?" I reached into my jacket and placed a single key on the table. He stared at it like it might explode. "What's that?" "The Ferrari. It's yours." "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity. It's an advance on your new chapter." I stood slowly. "The offer expires in 48 hours. After that, they move on. Think about your team. Think about Mom." He didn't speak as I walked out, but as I reached the porch, I heard it. The sound of a hand picking up a key. The next morning, my phone buzzed. "Mom, he took the car this morning. Didn't say a word, just drove it." By noon, Evergrove called. Henry Roth said, "Your father reached out. We're moving forward." I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just sat at my desk, stared at the warehouse blueprints on my screen, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to him, to the version of me that didn't give up. 2 days after the Evergrove offer was accepted in principle, I got a call from someone I didn't expect. Julian Marks, an investor from East Bay Ventures, one of the firms that had ghosted me a year ago. His tone was different now. "Word is, you've got something real, and Redwood's got you locked up. But that doesn't mean other doors are closed." I didn't say anything at first. Then he added, "We'll triple whatever Evergrove is offering. Forget the landscaping play. We'll take your tech, roll it into our own fintech arm, and prep for acquisition in under 12 months. Real exit potential. We're talking hundreds of millions, Aiden, not just scraps from a buyout." He made it sound clean, like a shortcut, and for a brief moment, I saw it. Flying back to New York, joining the power players, being the guy they all underestimated but couldn't ignore anymore. No small-town dad drama, no broken lawnmowers, just sleek offices, investor dinners, and exponential scaling. Then I pictured Henry Roth's handshake, his promise to keep my father's crew employed, the way Eli's face lit up when I offered him the COO role, the warehouse we'd leased, the blueprint taped to my apartment wall. I thought about Mom finally sleeping through the night, and Dad, still angry, still proud, but driving that car like a man trying to remember who he used to be. I cleared my throat. "I'm not interested." Julian laughed. "Is this personal? Because I'd rethink that. Sentiment doesn't scale." I smiled without humor. Number but character does. I ended the call. Afterward, I sat in silence for a long time, wondering if I'd just walked away from something huge or saved something irreplaceable. Because this wasn't just about ROI or equity stacks anymore. It was about proving to myself that what we were building in Savannah had more than financial value. It had roots. It had people. And if success meant trampling the very thing I'd set out to protect, then it wasn't success at all. 2 months later, I stood at the edge of a makeshift stage in the middle of our newly renovated warehouse. Concrete floors, string lights overhead. The smell of sawdust still lingered in the air from the last-minute construction work. Horizon Analytics was no longer a theory scribbled on napkins. It was real, breathing, staffed. Nearly 200 people filled the space: engineers, data analysts, city council members, a couple of journalists, even some former skeptics who once told me I was just a kid with an idea. And in the very back, arms crossed, stood my father, still in his pressed work shirt, still unsure of what to make of all this. I adjusted the mic. "Thank you for being here," I began. "Today isn't just the launch of a company. It's the launch of a mission. Horizon exists to make financial tools accessible to everyone, not just Wall Street, not just institutions, everyone. Applause broke out, brief but strong. We're proud to be doing this right here in Savannah, where legacy meets innovation. Then came the part that I'd rehearsed over and over. We're also announcing our first official partnership. Horizon is investing $2 million in Evergrove Regional Holdings, the new parent company of several local service-based businesses, including what was once known as Mercer Landscaping. There was a ripple through the crowd. Some turned to my father. He didn't move. As part of this partnership, we're launching a technology initiative to help traditional industries adapt, thrive, and grow in a digital economy. And heading this initiative is Ray Mercer. Now the applause swelled. I looked at him directly. His jaw tightened. He nodded, barely. But he didn't look away. He's spent 4 decades building something that can't be downloaded or copied. Real experience, real leadership. This isn't about replacing the old with the new. It's about building something better together. I stepped back from the mic. As the music came on and people started to mingle, I stayed on stage for a moment longer, watching him, still, silent. But he was there. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. Later, as I was heading toward the back to thank people for coming, he stepped into my path. "You planned this," he said, not accusing, just knowing. "I planned to build something that mattered," I replied. Everything else just fell into place. He glanced around the room, young staff typing on tablets, investors sipping coffee, the Horizon banner hanging overhead. "Your name's not on the building," he said. "Neither was yours," I answered. "But everyone knew who built it." He looked at me for a long moment, then held out his hand. And this time, didn't hesitate. 6 months later, I sat in my corner office overlooking the Savannah River. The glass reflected the early morning sun as barges drifted by like quiet memories. On my desk was a framed article from the Georgia Business Ledger. Local tech firm revives traditional industries, creates 150 jobs. It felt surreal. Not because of the numbers, not even because of the money, but because of what we'd built. We weren't just a startup anymore. Horizon Analytics had become a bridge, connecting the digital world to the hands that built the foundation beneath it. The same hands my father once thought would be forgotten. He and I weren't close, probably never would be. But every Wednesday, he showed up for our internal meetings on the Traditional Industries program. He brought blueprints, notes, ideas. And more importantly, he brought people. Plumbers, electricians, tree cutters, roofers. Guys with grit in their knuckles and stories etched into their skin. They don't want handouts, he told me once. They want tools that actually work. Things that don't talk down to them. And for the first time, I didn't just hear him. I listened. The partnership with Evergrove had exceeded all projections. 3-state expansion, retention up, efficiency doubled. And the crew that once wore Mercer Landscaping uniforms? Now they had stock options, paid training, and real health care. Mom had finally retired from tutoring and was traveling for the first time in her life. I got a photo from her last week, cooking class in Florence, with Dad beside her, wearing an apron that said, "King of Garlic." "You believe this?" she wrote. He actually sautéed something. Liam had joined us as marketing director. Eli was thriving as COO. And we just hired 30 grads from local colleges. The best part? They didn't have to leave Savannah to find opportunity anymore. As for me, I no longer felt the need to be the loudest voice in the room. The $14 million deal that once felt like the finish line had become something else entirely. A beginning. As I walked through the hallway, I paused by the values wall. 6 sleek panels with one quote at the bottom that wasn't mine. It came from Dad. Remember whose shoulders you stand on. I smiled. In the parking lot, my old black sedan sat next to Dad's new pickup. No Ferrari in sight. No one needed it anymore. We'd both made our points. I slid behind the wheel and took the long way home along the water. For the first time in years, success didn't feel like something I had to prove. It felt like something we were building together. So if you've made it this far, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment. Because maybe there's someone out there still waiting to be seen. Not for what they've done wrong, but for what they dared to build anyway.